Good afternoon, everybody. How are you guys doing today? It's awfully quiet. But I'm also competing against, you guys weren't looking for Christoph's session, were you? Okay, yeah, you're here for the right one. Okay, so my name is Peter Chittum. I'm one of the developer evangelists here at Salesforce.com.
My name's Adrian Smalley. I'm one of the lead architects for Acumen Solutions based in London.
So we, Adrian and I, probably about 8 months ago, kind of met each other. I'd been playing around with getting Visualforce to work in Salesforce1. Adrian had been playing around with AngularJS, and we thought, hey, this is interesting. So we kind of got together and built an app together, and this is kind of the story. But the whole purpose of this really is to bring AngularJS to existing Salesforce developers, so to give people who are familiar with Salesforce, familiar with Visualforce, an idea of where do you go to build an AngularJS application, and then it sort of hangs on the story of this event app that we built.
Quick show of hands, how many people have dabbled in Angular so far? How many people love it? How many people are just confused by it? Yeah, because my experience was what the hell, what the hell, what the hell, what the hell, what the hell. Oh, amazing. So stick with it. It's brilliant when you make the breakthrough. Hopefully this can help.
Definitely. So before we get started, you guys know this safe harbor slide, I'm sure. Don't make any product purchases based on any forward-looking statements I make today. Make your purchases of both product and stock based on things that are really in the product in GA. So there we go. That's me. My Twitter handle is pchittum, and my GitHub account is pchittum. There we go. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, if you are interested in any of the stuff I've thrown about as far as code, you can check that out.
And this is my slide. You can follow me at Adrian Smalley. I've also got a GitHub account, which is /Adrian Smalley. So yeah, give me a shout out on Twitter. I'm always looking for new people to banter.
And Adrian's going to start out with a little demo.
Yep, thank you, Peter. So before we get kicked off, I want to show you what we've built so you can get a feel for the app, so when we explain it to you, you know what we're talking about. So the first thing we have here is just the standard Salesforce 1 running on an iPad. So we've created a tab called Manage Events. So the concept here is an event management app that allows you to set up events, speakers, attendees, slots, kind of like maybe a Dreamforce-style app. The specific purpose of this actually was for the support team to have an app that they could use on an iPad. So whenever you sort of found someone, like the people dressed in blue around here, asked them for help, they could use this iPad app to give you information. So that's the kind of context. And this here is our first Angular page, and it's running routing as well, which you'll see is the really fast transitions between the pages. So to give you a comparison, I can use the standard Salesforce 1 page here to edit or view information about the event, if it loads. So here we're showing how Angular can just use URLs to jump between standard pages. So this is the event detail page. I can click back, and I can have a look at the sessions. So these are all the sessions that are going on for a given day.
I didn't get on the presenter Wi-Fi.
There we go. So here you see lots of little cool features. So you've got a Gantt chart there showing all the different sessions that are going on at what times in each of the different rooms. You can have multiple day tabs across the top. You've got a list of the different sessions here. We've actually got little speaker profiles on the right, and we've got information like a hot event here. We've actually integrated this into Twitter. So if you go to EventFlex, you'll find these posts there that have been at this particular session. So we've brought that information in. We're using that information to show which sessions are hot and which are not. So if you're, I don't know if you guys sort of use the Dreamforce app today, but there's so many events going on, it's really hard to know what to go and attend. But something like this, the Twitter chat around a particular event, might make you go. We've also got another cool feature, which, again, if you've used the Dreamforce community, you've followed people. So I've actually integrated this into the app too. So you can see I'm following Johnny Bravo, and he shows up here in the bottom right. but actually shows up on my list too as a contacts, so number of friends that are going to particular events. Great way if you're targeting to meet up with someone and things like that, so you can target them and find out where they're going to. Got a quick search here, so if you wanted to look for a quick sort of bit of information on Chatter, so you just type CHCT, instantly refreshes the DOM. And I think probably one of the cooler features is you can toggle this Gantt chart really quickly. So if I want to see all the different speakers, what they're going to see, when they're speaking, or by topic. So we've got one in here which is on Chatter. So that's the app that we've built. You can also raise a case if there's any problems, and that goes to a central case queue. And if I show you that. And we've also integrated it to D3.js, so we're using that for charting. So it just looks a bit better than the standard dashboards on Salesforce1. So that's the app we built in 2 weeks, and I guess we're going to go through how. If I just toggle back over.
To 7, yeah.
7. So just a little word of warning. So the app you've just seen, it's open source, so anyone can have it. It's on my GitHub account at the moment. It's not quite polished, so I wouldn't install it into production yet, but there's heaps of great accelerators there which can get you well on your way. And give me a shout if you want to extend it or anything like that. So our approach. Acumen Solutions has a drive methodology, which is kind of the stuff across the top there. And we sort of followed that loosely, but in a really tight time frame. So we sort of kicked off with a couple of discussions around what we wanted to build and achieve. We then sat down and defined exactly what the app was going to do. We built it, we delivered it, and we launched it today, basically. And you can see the timeline below. So that's in days. So we spent a day on the UX. We spent 2 days configuring Salesforce1 and getting the object model in place. We spent another 2 days pulling together the Angular app. We spent 2 more days connecting the data layer, which Peter's going to go through in a little bit more detail. And then we spent 3 days doing the front-end development. So you can see there that you get a pretty fully fledged app, pretty interactive in a very little time. So for me, I'm just going to explore a little bit on the sort of UX and approach there. My advice to everyone here is before jumping into the code, there's lots of great stuff that comes from agencies when they're designing consumer-facing websites. Take a look at some of their approaches. So they have a look at the solution. They then go through wireframing, some rough object modeling, and then finally delivering the solution rather than jumping straight into code. The team that we worked with was a UX and BA person. We had an admin do the config for us, and Pete and I, the handsome gentleman, as the Angular and Salesforce dev. We actually ran this using Google Docs and Balsamiq. So if you've not checked out Balsamiq for wireframing before, it's great, really easy to use. We actually used Git issues and GitHub to do our project management too. So some really cool integration with our code commits and the tasks and milestones we had running. So again, if you've not used that before, well worth checking out. So first step, user experience. So the first step is to start with personas. So that we listed out all the different roles that we're going to use this particular app. So we've got someone who's managing the dashboards and reports for all the cases coming in. We've got a person who's on the shop floor, and we've got an admin who's managing the system. So we listed out all the different use cases and stories for each of those different people, like what they wanted from the solution. And by putting ourselves in the mindset of those individuals, it allowed us to sort of flesh out a process pretty quickly and pretty easily. We then prioritized the stories, so we chopped off all the ones that we weren't going to be able to deliver and just focused on the core problem, which is at your fingertips information in the field. We designed the user flows, the rough process steps. We pulled together the wireframes. We put together a high-level design, so we sat down and sort of mocked up the screens before going into build, so we had a really clear idea of where we were going before we started. So this just gives you an idea of what the wireframes look like and what the final product looked like. So you can see there's large similarities. We did make some tweaks towards the end. But I think for me, the benefit here is we built this in a single attempt. So by spending the time up front doing the designs and really thinking about the use cases and user flows, it allowed us to just focus on developing and getting it right first time. And since we've built it, I think there's been basically only a couple of small minor revisions. So highly recommend that approach if you've never tried it before. It's a slight tweak on the standard agile process with a couple of other steps up front. I think it's you, Peter.
Okay, so as I said, I came to this really as at the point of playing around a lot with getting Visualforce working on the Salesforce1 mobile application. So we're going to start to dive into some of the code behind how we actually built this application, kind of starting from the basics of what is the Salesforce1 mobile app. So has everyone here used the Salesforce1 mobile application? Yes, pretty much. And who here has built Visualforce in Salesforce1? So about a third to half of people there. So Salesforce1 mobile app is essentially a hybrid mobile application. And you're all familiar with the point-and-click functionality that you can use to customize it. In addition to that, there's three things sort of programmatically that you can do to customize. So Visualforce pages is one of those. You can also have Canvas applications integrated with the user interface and have those appear as part of Salesforce1. And of course, we've just launched Lightning Components, so that becomes the next way, the next wave, you could say, of, oh, wow, look what I just did, of integrating new programmatic functionality into the Salesforce1 mobile application. So Salesforce1 in Visualforce is obviously what we had to work with at the time. And there are a few options that you have. I've explored kind of what I think are the three most common ones. The first one is a publisher action. So on the left-hand side, you can see just like you would have a publisher action, such as new task or post to chatter, you can have a publisher action that launches a Visualforce page, and then that Visualforce page would have to be programmed to post back to chatter. Now, we use just a standard Visualforce tab. You then have to surface that into Salesforce1. And the third option that I've put up there is the mobile card functionality, which is a sort of specialized user interface that appears on the list, the related list portion of Salesforce1. You tap through, and then it actually renders the Visualforce page, and you can actually access that. So we went with just a plain old standard Visualforce tab based on what our application was doing. A couple of basic things that you want to bear in mind when you're bringing Visualforce into Salesforce1. The standard doc type of Visualforce is HTML 4.1, so you want to make sure to have it HTML5 compliant by adding the doc type tag there. And in the light blue there, there's show header, sidebar, and standard style sheets all set to false, and that just makes sure we strip as much as we can out of the Salesforce user interface that gets downloaded with your Visualforce page. So the actual Angular architecture itself, so how do you get the Angular app into Visualforce? Let's talk through that a little bit. If we look at this, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the core Angular architecture. So what does Angular expect, or what's the standard pattern for an Angular application? And then I want to kind of draw parallels or kind of draw some lines between that and how do you structure your app in Visualforce. So first of all, Angular is a single-page application framework, if you're not familiar with it. So you start with a base HTML page. In that page, you're going to import a bunch of JavaScripts. There will be some core Angular libraries in addition to other libraries that you might want to include. And then, of course, any CSS that you want for the look and feel of your page. And then there are typically a number of static HTML views that are going to cycle through a view, an actual div element on your core page that we'll see a little bit later. In the Visualforce world, or the way that we built our app, is that the only Visualforce page that we actually had was the base HTML page. That's the entry point for Visualforce. You can't really do away with that. Everything else we put into static resources. Static resources are typically used for things like JavaScript and CSS, but static resources can also be static HTML. So for those HTML view partials that cycle through the actual AngularJS main page, we actually made those static resources as well. And that way we bypass the whole Visualforce renderer, and we go directly to the static HTML when we access that. Of course, the backend is going to be some Apex classes. That's how Visualforce talks to Salesforce, although we did have at our disposal the new remote object feature. So we'll talk about that a little bit later and how we use that. Now, one of the peculiarities we had to deal with was because we put everything into static resources, we had to have something that represented a JavaScript object so that we could do some static resource mapping. And we just did that as a JavaScript object declared in that main page. And we did all of our static resource identifiers as properties of that particular object. And we'll see that a little bit later as well. And then, so the basic components of our page are basically Visualforce, AngularJS, and Bootstrap SF1. I'm going to try and coin a term here today with this very small audience. I think we should call this the VAB stack, don't you think? I mean, there's a lot of people who are building apps this way right now. Visualforce, AngularJS, and Bootstrap, whether it's the Bootstrap SF1 library or just other Bootstrap themes. If you're not familiar, who here has used Bootstrap? Let's just ask that. So about half. If you're not familiar with Bootstrap, it's kind of in every web page that you see these days on the internet. It's kind of the de facto way to have a responsive design web page. And it works really well with touch-based user interface or mobile user interfaces. I have that out of order. So the Bootstrap SF1 library, I'll come back to a slide on that in a moment, is basically a theme for Bootstrap. Now, why do we pick Angular? Adrian kind of talked about this already, but Angular makes for nice structured JavaScript. It has very strong conventions, and this is, I think, one of the things that a lot of developers struggle against a little bit. But as Adrian said, as you start to do more and more with it, you realize just how much this can kind of boost your productivity.
I think for me, the single biggest change was how easy it was for Peter and I to work on an Angular app compared to, say, a jQuery app where we have no idea who's doing what. So by having a structure like this, we can actually collaborate really easily, particularly with GitHub. So I'd highly recommend it if you've got a big complex app with multiple different people involved. You can isolate it out really easily and bring it all back together. So I think that's a real benefit of Angular for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Angular is very adaptable. It's very extensible. You can use the bits you want. You can get rid of the bits you don't want. So from that standpoint, it's very useful. It's got a very big community of developers. The rate of adoption has meant that there are a lot of people building components in Angular. So that makes it easier to go out and find stuff like the Gantt chart or the charting feature that Adrian used. And we really think that it's enterprise ready. Angular's out there. It's being used by large enterprises today. So why not? I mean, this really fits with what we're doing here at Salesforce and the Force.com platform. So to take a quick look at the actual AngularJS App Startup, I'll start at the bottom. And what you see there is a little bit of JavaScript. We declare this EventFlex variable. And then this is actually the bootstrapping process is what this is called. And what we're doing is we're identifying the modules that we're going to use in this Angular app. So if you've used Node or if you've used other modular-based programming languages, it's basically the same thing. I'm declaring what's going to get pulled in as part of this project. And then those will be made available later on as we go and build out other features. Now at the top, you can see the very first line of where I'm declaring that div. That ng app equals EventFlex is where we're then binding this Angular functionality to my page. So now we basically have a place that's going to render this Angular application. And this can really be any part of your user interface, which is one of the nice flexible things about Angular. The next thing that you're going to do is set up your routing. This allows you to do mapping between actual files, requested URLs, and then the controllers that are going to be used with them. So what you see here are a couple of the routes that we've set up. There's a base route, which is the first when that you see there on the third line. And that's obviously the root URL. Remember the static items object that we set up with all of our references to static resources. So that's in yellow there where it says static items, and I'm referencing the static resource that maps to the actual thing that we want to request at that point. And then the controller is in green. So, and Adrian's going to talk a bit more about controllers later. But that's going to be basically the functionality, the logic behind all of the buttons, the event handlers, et cetera, for that particular page.
I think the one thing that routing gives you is real speed between pages. So when you're using Visualforce on Salesforce 1, the load times are really long. So if you've got a multi-page or multi-component app, using routing means it preloads everything and just cycles through it really, really quickly. So for a bit of extra effort, I'd highly recommend doing that for any Salesforce1 apps that you're building.
And so here's the Bootstrap SF1 theme. I thought I'd moved that a little bit earlier, but there we go. So if you go to github.com/Salesforce Foundation, so Salesforce Foundation, you guys are familiar with the 111 model. We talk about it all week long at Dreamforce. We love the foundation. And these developers are the ones who built this, this Bootstrap theme. It's out there. It's available for anyone to use or to contribute to if you want to do a pull request. And what this means is that if you've used Twitter Bootstrap, you can use the same Bootstrap classes that you're familiar with, and what you get is a Salesforce1 looking application. OK, so let's take a quick look at data access. So I bootstrapped my app. I've set up my routes. What I need to do is set up some reusable services that I can use to go back to Salesforce or to get access to data. And that's where we're going to take a look here. So data access for Salesforce1, when we're looking at Visualforce, we basically have three options. There's the new remote object feature. There's remote action Apex methods. And then finally, of course, there's REST API. Now, we didn't really use any REST API requests. This would be for very large requests because both remote objects and remote actions have fairly small request sizes that are allowed. So if you need to do something like take a picture with a device and upload it, or maybe make a very large describe call, those kinds of things, you might want to do those with the actual REST API. But pretty much everything else these days you can handle with one of the other options. So what we're going to do is go through and set up a bunch of services in Angular. And so you can see here we go back to that EventFlex object we call service, and then that's where we declare the actual service called EF services in this case. And then each of the actual functions that we declare as part of that object, get all events, get sessions, and there were a bunch of other ones, that's where we actually put the business logic. And then on the next box down below, when we actually go and instantiate a controller, we pass in that EF services, and then that's what's going to give us access to what we need. So Adrian's going to go over controllers a little bit later, so I don't want to spoil any of that. But that's the basics of getting the services in place. Let's take a look at what a service looks like for a remote object, one for a remote action in Apex, and then we're going to move on. So has anyone used the new remote object feature? Yep, so a couple of you. The nice thing about remote object is it's a lot like standard controller, but really it services a JavaScript API. So what that means is we can now make these asynchronous calls that are stateless, no more view state, and we don't need to write any Apex code to make that happen. So in the top box there, you can see the declaration of a couple of remote objects. So the first one there is called event. And on the same line where it says Apex remote object model, name equals event, we have a JS shorthand. Things like object names, field names, especially when you start dealing with managed packages, can get very, very long. So we support the ability to create a JavaScript-friendly name for all of these artifacts that you're going to get access to. And that's what the EVT JS shorthand is. And you'll see in a second, or actually you can see down below, where I'm actually declaring this particular function as part of my service on the new sobjectModel.evt. That EVT reference is the JS shorthand reference that I set up above.
And for those of you making managed packages, this will save your life. So no more package prefix JavaScript problems. So that's why that shorthand is useful.
One thing that I'll mention along those lines, so that SObject model is a generic JavaScript API that's made available. In the remote object, the top level Apex remote objects declaration, you can create your own JavaScript namespace that corresponds to this particular application. Now, we didn't do that for this one, but you can do it so that your JavaScript isn't going to fight with someone else's JavaScript. So that's the basics of using remote objects in our Angular service. Remote action is pretty straightforward. Remote actions have been around for a long time. Anyone used Apex remote actions before? Yeah, so definitely more people there. So you can see our call to the Visualforce remoting manager invoke actions call. And then we're back to that static items that we saw earlier. So again, where we added the shortcuts to all of the static resource names, we're just using that again because this is sitting in another static resource. And then that's pretty much it. So that's the basics of wiring this into our data. And now Adrian's going to come back, and we're going to talk about components, community, and we're going to wrap things up.
Cool. Thanks, Peter. So I think the first thing that I'd suggest to anyone who's looking at building an app is have a quick Google for the components that you're looking for. So we actually use two components in the app that I demoed earlier. And it's a great idea to use other people's components for a few reasons. One, it saves you loads of time. It also is often better tested. So these components are reused, throughout everyone else's different implementations. They've probably tested it in many different browsers and things like that and updated their core module. It's pretty easy for you to update your own. You just need to go to GitHub and take a pull, and then you should be able to update your own app. So really useful to utilize other people's components. It's pretty easy to search because the word Angular and directive are not sort of that commonly used in English language. So if you search for Angular directive Gantt chart, it'll be really relevant. So it's really easy to find. We use two, the Angular Gantt and the Angular charts, which wraps D3.js. So for those of you who are familiar with that framework, it's really, really popular for charting. So I'm just going to explain how we wired these in. So we first download the JavaScript, obviously, and then install it into our Visualforce page, just as you would standardly. We then add a little line which says Angular charts in the injection logic that we saw before. So that's just, they'll tell you this in the help page on GitHub often, what the app name is. So just add the app name in, and then you're going to need to obviously provide, in this case, the charts with data. So you need to provide a configuration variable and a data variable. And then that charting thing that you just saw before is literally one line of code. So it's just div data.ac chart, the type, which was pi, as you saw before, and the data, which I've passed in, and the configuration, which I've also passed in. So you can see how it just takes away a huge amount of complexity out of your own code, and you let someone else build that component for you. So you can focus just on the bits that you're interested in building. So we're going to continue on to building the rest of the page. So I thought it'd be useful just to explain sort of the execution cycle. So you load the page up, and then once Angular is loaded, it calls an init, so that initialization. That initialization then goes out to the services that Peter was talking about before. Once you're in the services, we then call out to Salesforce using remote action or remote object. Once the Apex classes return the data, we then return it back to the services. We return it back to the controller. We can either then push it through to a directive, which we saw before for the charting information, or we push it back into the front-end UI, and voila, it's done. So this process happens pretty much every time you edit the page. It doesn't always go all the way back down to Salesforce, but this cycle is how every action happens within an Angular app. So for those of you who want to start building Angular apps, it's actually surprisingly easy. So a lot of Salesforce developers aren't that familiar with JavaScript. However, you can kind of skip over a little bit of that by using a framework like Angular. So we have a similar MVC concept. So you can see here you've got an Apex controller and an Angular controller. And you can see I've set them up so they're broadly similar. So with some simple syntax changes, we've got very, very similar bits of information and very similar ways of coding. And you'll build better apps in JavaScript by using MVC. So you can separate out all of your logic. And also the other benefit is you don't have to control all the events all the time. So when the data changes, Angular updates the page without you having to explicitly call it. If you have a look at the Visualforce page as well, you can see there, again, you have a ng repeat tag, which is actually more powerful than Visualforce, which I'll show you in a minute. But again, it's largely similar. It's HTML with a little bit of extra markup on top of it. So again, it should be relatively familiar for those of you who are developers of standard Apex and Visualforce. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the key components that make the front end, the layout. So the key one is bindings, right? So that's the information from the controller that we set up before and displaying it on the page. Now, Angular has some really cool accelerators for you, actually. So that's the standard way that you stamp it onto the page, double brackets. But as you know, for those of you who've done JavaScript development before, the standard way of displaying a date is that really weird, long, descriptive type, which is pretty much useless for any page display. So Angular actually packages up a couple of really easy sort of workarounds, formatters. So you can see there with just a pipe and date, you can set a format for that, and Angular will update and display in whatever format you choose. So for me, I like using date formats, as you saw before, with Monday, the 13th of December 14. To do that traditionally is a real pain. You have to write a whole bunch of parsing and map and array lookups. So this is great, just one bit of code there. So if you want a two-way connection, right? So that's information you type into the front end, and it goes back to the controller and refreshes the page. You just type ngModel equals the variable name. And you can see here that obviously we don't have $scope in front of it. So $scope is only for the controller. And as soon as you're on the front end, it's just the variable name. So that's the way I did that live search. It's that easy. I just type that in, and I'll show you how the filtering works in a second. Filtering works on top of repeats. So repeats are standard loops. There's some cool little things I've added here just for your reference. You can do a repeat over an object, which not everyone knows. So you don't have to reformat the JSON that's coming back from the server if it's not coming back in an array format already. And you can also add a little filter. So that search feature of that list is literally, you can see, about 30 characters. So ngModel on one side, and then filter, colon, that same variable, and that gives me a live filtering list. So Angular is doing a huge amount of heavy lifting for you just with a couple of lines of code. I remember writing these in jQuery. They would probably be 50, 150, 200 lines of code to repeat this. So some great accelerators there. If you want to restrict the search, so that search searches across the entire object in each of the arrays, inside the arrays. So if you want to restrict it just to one attribute, you can just add a little curly bracket, name equals that particular search text. And finally, it also has the option of order by as well. So again, you can control how the information is being displayed to the user, and you can sort of sort it by date or by speaker or whatever you'd like to do in this particular example. So already you can see it's more powerful than the standard Apex repeat. And for me, this means I can pull together an app really, really quickly because I don't have to do all of that stuff in the back end. I just get the data, and then I can do all of the front-end control in Angular. So the kind of the last big component of Angular, and this is the bit that most developers struggle with, is directives. So directives are Angular's way of putting out a new component, I think is probably the simplest way of explaining it, a standalone component. So for those of you who went to the Lightning demos, it's kind of a similar concept. It's an isolated unit that accepts some information coming in and then kind of operates completely independently and then sends either events or information back. So there's a couple of ways to do this, but for those of you who are building on Visualforce, I highly recommend using the attribute way, which you can see here is the my-directive, rather than a new tag. It just doesn't play nice with Visualforce sometimes. So make sure that you put something inside the equal sign as well. Otherwise, it'll get stripped out by the Visualforce parser. So the key components that go into a directive, you need obviously some HTML, some sort of template of some sort. You need to specify data, a scope of some sort, and also a link function. Now that's all that happens after the component is built and allows you to build any sort of logic or UI logic that you'd like to use. So from then on, we can simply reference it by adding the attribute and then passing any data in using data item equals, and we can pass that information through to the directive. So I've got a sample one up here for those of you who want to try later. So this here, I'll just take you through it quickly. So you create the directive like this, and then the restrict means how you want that information to be, what key component Angular is looking for to run this directive. So A is attribute, as we described before. E is element, which is the other example I gave. Replace is true. That means it'll replace whatever called it with the HTML from this directive. And then you've got your own scope here. This allows you to specify exactly what information you want to pass into it. So for instance, you've got a huge complex app. You don't want to send the entire scope into a small directive. so you can just specify what information needs to go in. We've got the template here. You can use a template URL, so you can actually specify like a big document somewhere else. I've just created one here, which is just typed HTML, so it's completely up to you how you'd like to do that. And then you've got the link function here, which should look very, very similar to the previous controller, right? It's just information that's going to be displayed inside the template that we've got here. So I think the last thing to note here is often people get a bit worried about losing control of the DOM. So if you use the element tag here, which you can see, that gives you access to the DOM again. So you can package this up with any jQuery components you might have or anything like that. So you can bind, in this case, a click function to the element. So if I click that, it'll run the reset value function there. So it's just a little encapsulated example for you that should get you well on your way. So the app in the end. This app actually brought together a huge amount of sort of Salesforce features and functionality into just one-page app. So we've got communities driving the featured speakers and the speakers on the right. We've got the Salesforce1 providing the wrapper. We've got Service Cloud integration through the Razor case. We've got Force.com with all the custom objects driving this. And then if you remember the pop-up, we then had Twitter integration driving the heat of each particular event. And as I've mentioned here, we've also got Chatter follows driving what events my friends are attending, and that sort of networking effect there. So this app draws on a huge number of components of the Salesforce platform to sort of give the end user a really simple and easy to use kind of interface, which you guys can all download if you like. Any questions? We're not that intimidating, really. So a perfect question.
Just to repeat the question, would you recommend remote objects versus remote actions in Apex, yeah?
So perfect example. The chart I just showed you was using a remote action because I built a wrapper class so I could format the data before it came back. And that means that, again, my chart is just one line of code. I just make one call to the charting engine, and it sends everything back formatted, and I can just display it on the page. So I think for big data jobs or where you've got complex stuff you don't want to do in the UI, then use remote action. Otherwise, remote object is much faster. Just a word of warning, though, is all of the data is buried in underscore props when you get the JSON back from remote object.
Yeah, one other thing is that with remote actions, you can actually have a transactional call that you can chain together changes to data in several different objects and have those act as one single atomic transaction. But you can't do that with remote object. In the case of a remote object, if I do a create on a record, that's the transaction. It's very difficult to then roll that record back if I then follow on and create a second one. So where you want transactional interaction that's, again, relatively complex, remote action is probably the best way to go.
I think the last one that's worth mentioning is you can't do relationship queries in remote object. Yeah. So you can't take a nested list, or you can't look up, more annoyingly, you can't look up to a parent object to get a field. So that's just some lessons I learned playing around with it. So.
Although check...
is this part of the safe harbor or not part of safe harbor?
Check with safe harbor. So I know that that's on the product roadmap, is to add relationship queries. I don't think it's in the GA this release, but it's something they want to put in.
Any other questions? Check it out on GitHub. Have a look around.
Yeah. Thanks everyone. Oh, wait. One more question.
Would you mind going back to that slide that I think it was?
Yeah, sure.
So ways back, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was slide 2. We will get there.
Note to self, next time put it on the
last slide.
thank you slide. There we go.
which is good, actually. So as you're all taking photos, you've got the little like caveats in there as well. So monster win.
Excellent. Thanks very much, everybody. Hope you have a great rest of Dreamforce.
Thank you very much.